World War II was a pivotal moment in world history when not only the survival of the United States was at stake, but of democracy throughout the world. World War II veterans will always be known as the greatest generation, for every future generation will forever be in their debt. We need to remember the contribution of minorities in World War II, especially today when white supremacy is on the rise. In fact, since 9/11, white supremacists and other far-right extremists have been responsible for almost 3 times as many attacks on U.S. soil as Islamic terrorists. According to Time magazine, August 19, 2019, what does a terrorist look like? We need to remember and give thanks for these veterans because our freedom wouldn't be in existence had it not been for their sacrifices. The armed forces were completely segregated during World War II, as much of the country was. Jim Crow was still the law of the land. Although they were often relegated to menial positions, 1.2 million African Americans served with distinction during World War II, and their service helped not only to win the war, but also to accelerate the civil rights movement in the war's aftermath. David Field of Cordova, Tennessee, served as a platoon leader and company commander of a black service company in support of combat troops. His service company followed the combat troops from Normandy to Belgium, crossing the Rhine River at Worms, and heading east to Würzburg and south through Bavaria. Years later, Field still regarded his serving as the white officer of an all-black company as the greatest honor of his life. Field wrote, "Perhaps my greatest satisfaction during the war came from the fact that most of my service was with the black, called Negro then, troops. As I am sure you know, at the time the armed services were totally segregated. There were very few black officers. In fact, for about 3 years, I was assigned to black units and never had even one black officer assigned." Most white officers, as Field recalled, did not want to serve with black troops and often volunteered for combat duty to avoid serving with black soldiers. Field remembered, "I am sure some of them died as a result." Because white officers often resented serving in black units, Field wrote these units were often poorly led. "As for me, I say with pride that the white officers who served with me and under me were absolutely colorblind. As a result, we had outstanding units made up of excellent young black men who, in spite of their status in the United States at that time, served their country with distinction. For me personally, my greatest achievement during the war was to command black troops in such a manner that we respected each other and were loyal to each other. I only wish I could see some of them now, many years later, and tell them once more how much I admired all that they did and how great they were in responding to what they were assigned to do, even in a segregated army." During World War II, Jim Crow permeated every aspect of the United States. Blacks served in segregated divisions, primarily in combat support positions, cooks, quartermasters, delivering supplies and grave-digging duties. In the South, blacks could not eat in the same restaurants their German POWs did. They couldn't even use the same latrines as whites in German POWs. Even the blood supply was segregated. Lloyd Huggins recalled when his E Company Infantry Regiment received a platoon of black troops. This was a first, as blacks had previously been confined to serving as supply, labor, or transport troops. Huggins wrote that many of his new recruits were not exactly there by choice. "These were volunteers, all of whom were under 5 to 20-year court-martial sentences for black marketing, theft, etc. Such sentences were to be lifted if they performed well. Some volunteers. It made me very angry that for the ultimate punishment they were sent to fight as infantry soldiers. Damn the army and its stupidity." The men of E Company soon came to respect the black soldiers, who despite their sentences performed with extraordinary valor, seemingly in competition with the white platoons. "When the fighting was over and the platoon detached, some of the black soldiers left with tears in their eyes," Huggins recalled. To challenge the lie that blacks were inferior sailors, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People urged her husband in 1944 to commission the USS Mason, a destroyer, and the USS PC-1264, a submarine chaser, as the only two World War II naval ships with predominantly African American crews. "We had 144 blacks and about 40 whites on board," recalled James W. Graham of Roosevelt, New York, in a winter 1997 edition of The Bridge, a naval recruiting publication. Black sailors filled all the ratings, and later some of the officer positions. "This was the first ship in history that had black guys serving as radio men, quartermasters, and signalmen," recalled Graham, who served as a radio man second class on the USS Mason and eventually became chairman of the association commemorating the Mason's service. Lorenzo Dufault of New York City, New York, served as a signalman on the USS Mason and understood that he and his fellow crew were making history. "Our battle was on two fronts at the time, prejudice and the enemy of democracy. We were the first to gain rates other than stewards, mates, and cooks. The black man had been denied the privilege of serving to his full capacity because of prejudice," Dufault recalled. At a time when segregation ruled most of the U.S., the USS Mason was fully integrated, with blacks sleeping alongside whites in the bunks and dining together in the mess hall. While aware of the historic significance of the Mason, its commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander William Blackford of Seattle, Washington, saw his ship as just another destroyer and not as an experiment. "I'm no crusader," Captain Blackford said. "I'm not out here to solve the race problem. I'm simply trying to run a good Navy ship." Dufault and the men of the Mason were fiercely loyal to their white captain, William Blackford, who understood our plight and was a great influence in making our ship perform at its best. He treated us as men and demanded the best out of us at all times, Dufault wrote. Like it or not, the black crew of the USS Mason were continuously under a microscope, especially when an admiral was sent out to observe them. Dufault said the black crew was keenly aware that if we fouled up, it would be a mark against our entire race. However, in 10 Atlantic crossings between 1944 and 1945, the Masons served with distinction, protecting convoys of ships by dropping depth charges on enemy submarines. The USS Mason's tensest moments were not, however, caused by enemy submarines, but by a fierce hurricane that it encountered in the North Atlantic while escorting a convoy of tugboats and barges. Dufault recalled the storm in 1997 in an interview with the South Shore Record. "The winds were 90 miles an hour, with waves 60 feet high. One minute we'd be on top of a wave, then we'd be at the bottom. The storm was so powerful, fear went right out of me. I put my hand in the man's, and I thought, if I survive this, I'll survive anything." The tugboats were no match for the hurricane, and 20 of their crew drowned. However, the USS Mason shepherded most of the convoy to safety, then returned into the storm to rescue the scattered ships that remained. The Mason steadfastly protected its convoy, despite a crack that had begun to split its deck. "We welded it, and we kept moving," Dufault recalled. Afterwards, the officers told the men they would receive a letter of commendation for their valor, but prejudice at the time prevented any such recognition. After the war, a second captain became commander of the USS Mason, replacing Captain Blackford. Graham told the South Shore Record this new captain did everything he could to discredit the USS Mason's achievements. "When he came on board, he tried to teach us to read and write, though most of us were high school or college graduates. He wrote a lot of negative reports about us, saying we smelled, that we couldn't swim, that we were hard to educate. He was also a bad captain. He rammed another ship, and he even hit a submarine." The USS Mason was decommissioned in October of 1945 and was scrapped 2 years later. President Clinton recognized the surviving 67 crew members of the USS Mason in 1994, finally awarding them the commendations they had been promised all those years ago. 10 years later, the Navy further honored the history-making crew when it commissioned a new USS Mason in 2004 and deployed it in the Operation Iraqi Freedom. Dufault and a few other surviving crew members of the World War II USS Mason traveled to Port Canaveral, Florida, for the commissioning. Dufault became friends with the new warship's crew and visited them whenever he could. The men of the USS Mason were proud of their achievements during the war on both fronts, in the sea against the Axis and in breaking the barriers of racial prejudice. Reflecting on the role the USS Mason played in integrating the armed forces, Dufault wrote in his letter to the author, "The purpose of life is to make it better for the next generation. We showed it can be done. Look at the Navy now. I'm 77 years old. I played a role, and I feel good about it. I don't have a lot of money, but I have a lot of pride." More than 50 years after his courageous service, First Lieutenant Vernon J. Baker of St. Marie, Idaho, became the only living African-American World War II soldier to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. Baker had been a platoon leader with Company C of the 370th Infantry Regiment, 92nd Division, when his platoon came under a heavy artillery barrage during the pre-dawn hours of April 5, 1945, on Hill 10 of a German mountain stronghold at Castle Aghinolfi in Italy. In a September 18, 1997 letter, Baker recalled the ominous setting of the battle. "The action took place on the high ground above the towns of Viareggio and Montenoso, Italy, on the 5th and 6th of April 1945. The castle commanded the high ground, overlooking the plain of the Cinquali Canal, which was the line of demarcation on the front line, separating Allied forces and the German army along the Gothic line." As Baker's platoon came within 250 yards of the castle, he spotted a telescope sticking out of a bunker slit. Baker quickly pointed his M1 into the slit and emptied it, killing the 2 German soldiers inside the bunker. Baker soon found a camouflage machine gun nest and killed the 2 Germans manning it. When Baker found his company commander, Captain John Runyon, a German threw a hand grenade at them both. Fortunately for Baker and Runyon, the grenade was a dud and bounced off Runyon's helmet. The German who threw it wasn't as fortunate. Baker shot and killed him. Before he was done, Baker would blast open another German hideout with his hand grenade and kill the 2 Germans inside it with a submachine gun. Despite Baker's heroics, his platoon was getting chewed up by the German artillery. Nonetheless, Baker was shocked when Captain Runyon ordered the troops to withdraw and told Baker that he was going to get reinforcements. Half a century later, Baker still didn't mince words when he recalled Runyon's actions. "First, commanding officers do not abandon their command on the field of battle to go for reinforcements. A move of that sort is designated to a trusted subordinate. A SEAL's job is to stay in command. That is why he is given a command. My feelings were, and I make no apologies for them, that Captain Runyon was a cowardly SOB, and myself and my comrades would stick it out until we were supplied with reinforcements, or we were dead, because at that time we were heady, with a sense of accomplishment, and that we had taken ground that had been denied to larger forces for months. We did not want to retreat." Baker didn't see or hear from Captain Runyon again until July 4, 1945, at Viareggio, Italy, when Runyon, who was white, was inexplicably decorated with a Distinguished Service Cross. Baker himself was given the Distinguished Silver Star, but he never spoke to his former commander. By the time Baker got down to the bottom of the hill and vomited, only 7 of his 25-man platoon still survived. But they had killed 26 Germans, destroyed 6 machine gun nests, 2 observer posts, and 4 dugouts. Baker couldn't believe he had survived it all. "I was not injured in that battle, and to this day I cannot understand why I was not, as men were being blown to bits and shot to death on either side of me. Adrenaline was pumping at full force." Baker was one of 1.2 million African Americans who served in World War II. Despite their numbers and their valor of service, none were awarded the nation's top military honor, the Congressional Medal of Honor. Only 9 African American soldiers received the second highest award, the Distinguished Service Cross. In 1995, the Pentagon asked military scholars from Shaw University in North Carolina to research why African Americans had been excluded from the nation's highest military honors during their service in World War II. The Shaw University 1997 report concluded, "While there is no official documentation for racial prejudice in the awards process for the Medal of Honor, this study concludes that the failure of an African American soldier to win a Medal of Honor most definitely lay in the racial climate and practice of the Army in World War II." Seeking to rectify the wrong, President Bill Clinton awarded 7 black World War II soldiers the Medal of Honor in the 1990s after a special Army Senior Officers Award Board had certified their heroic actions met their rigorous standards. All but one of the 6 recipients were given the Medal of Honor posthumously. Only First Lieutenant Vernon J. Baker of St. Marie, Idaho, lived to receive his Medal of Honor in person. For Baker, it was a moment of vindication, not just for himself, but for all the African Americans who had served their country with valor. In his letter, Baker wrote that his recognition was a sign that the United States was making progress towards racial equality, even if it still had a long way to go. Baker wrote, "Yes, we have a long way to go before we are really together, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and it is getting brighter." An estimated 500,000 Mexican Americans served in World War II. They were twice as likely to be born in the United States as Mexico. Most Mexican Americans were eager to serve and to finally feel like they were being recognized as true Americans. One two-block lane in Silvis, Illinois had an amazing 45 Mexican American sons sent off to war and was named Hero Street as a result. At least 11 Medal of Honor recipients were Mexican Americans. Like African Americans, many Mexican Americans returned home to find their heroism was not appreciated, and the racism they thought they were defeating in Nazi Germany still existed in American society. When the governor of Arizona declared August 14, 1945, Sylvester Herrera Day, in honor of Herrera receiving the Medal of Honor, the governor had to order Phoenix businesses to take down signs that read, "No Mexican Trade Wanted." Worse yet, when the widow of Private Felix Longoria of Three Rivers, Texas, received his remains 4 years after he died in combat in the Philippines, the local funeral home denied his widow the use of the chapel for its wake. The funeral home director explained, "We just never made it a practice to let them, Mexican Americans, use the chapel, and we don't want to start now." Jose M. Lopez had been born in Santiago, Jutlan, Mexico, but came to the U.S. illegally as a 13-year-old and falsified his birth certificate so he could join the Marines and serve his adopted country. On December 17, 1944, Lopez was near Krinkelt, Belgium, when he heard German tanks and infantry coming and feared they would soon overrun his company. Lopez wrote about what happened next. "I had 5 boxes of ammunition at the Battle of the Bulge. Someone helped me carry the 5 boxes of ammunition. My job was to guard the road, the valley, while my company rested at the foot of the forest. Captain McDonald was in command. I was in my foxhole several hours, approximately 3 to 5 hours. I was cold and I was tired. I heard the German tanks coming in the distance. I had to decide when to start shooting my machine gun. When I saw the German troops, I started firing my machine gun single-handedly. The tank was searching for me, and it started shooting its shells towards me. One shell hit so close that I was thrown backwards out of my foxhole. After a little while, I got my machine gun again. I got back in the foxhole, and I started shooting again. I stopped only after my supply of ammunition was exhausted." While firing his machine gun, Lopez kept changing positions and prayed to the Virgin of Guadalupe that he would be spared. Lopez went on, "The tank also continued with his aim at me during my firing, plus the German soldiers were advancing. I estimate the time that I was shooting at the Germans was about 45 minutes. I was now out of ammunition, and I decided to retreat. I picked up my machine gun, and I went looking for my company. The next day, my company commander went back to see what I did for my unit. They counted more than 100 Germans dead. The next thing I knew, I was being recommended for the Medal of Honor. My friends were very happy that I saved their lives, because they knew they would not be alive today if I had not fired my machine gun." Lopez received his Congressional Medal of Honor from President Truman on June 18, 1945. His citation noted that Lopez was almost solely responsible for allowing Company K to avoid being enveloped to withdraw successfully, and to give other forces coming up in support time to build a line which repelled the enemy drive. It's worth noting that in today's atmosphere of xenophobia, when the United States is busy building a wall between itself and Mexico, it's questionable whether this illegal alien would receive the Medal of Honor in today's climate. But back in 1944, a whole company had its lives to thank to Jose M. Lopez. 350,000 women served in the United States Armed Forces during World War II, both at home and abroad. General George C. Marshall and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt were both advocates of women serving in the military. In the Women's Army Corps, women served in more than 200 non-combatant roles in every theater of war. The 1,000 women and the Women's Air Force Service pilots flew planes from factories to bases, transported cargo, simulated strafing and military missions, and flew more than 60 million miles. About 74,000 women served in the United States Army and Navy Nurse Corps during World War II. While Pearl Harbor was America's most devastating blow on December 7, 1941, it was by no means the only one. Even as Pearl Harbor was still smoking, Japan launched coordinated attacks on vital U.S. possessions across the Pacific, including Wake Island, the Philippines, Guam, as well as British Malaya and Hong Kong. Young Hattie Brantley of Jefferson, Texas, had just begun her work as a nurse in the Philippines when shock is hardly the word. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, and we in the Philippines were tossed into war just as suddenly. The head nurse quickly reassured her medical team, telling them there wasn't anything to worry about, that they would not be bothered in Luzon by the Japanese. Later that evening, as shots rang out in the jungle, the nurses decided they indeed did have something to worry about. We moved in open buses on the early morning of Christmas Eve to the Bataan Peninsula, and all along the way we had to stop, get out, and lie in ditches because of the bombers, Brantley recalled. When the nurses arrived at the field site, they found that nothing was set up. They went to work creating 17 wards with approximately 35 beds in each. The wounded began arriving, crowding the tiny Field Hospital No. 1 before work was even done setting it up. Brantley found that the easy nights at Fort McKinley were gone for good as the nurses began working from sunup to sundown, treating the never-ending flow of casualties. Although there was no shortage of casualties, there was a shortage of supplies. Brantley and the other nurses knew that the stranglehold the Japanese had on the Americans in the peninsula meant that no further supplies would be forthcoming when the little they had ran out. Still, the wounded took it in stride as best they could. Hattie recalled one badly injured soldier who seemed more concerned about her than he did his own life-threatening injuries. I remember a sweet boy from the Midwest who lost all 4 limbs. I stopped by as often as I could. Once, after a quiet talk, he said, "What's a nice girl like you doing in a situation like this? You shouldn't be undergoing these hardships." Can you imagine? He said that to me. Holed up in the tunnels at Corregidor, the situation became increasingly dire for Brantley and the thousands of others taking refuge there. Brantley recalled the desperate conditions. It was hot and smelly, and we had more than 1,000 patients. With so many people living so close together, nothing was adequate. The food was worse than, well, by this time somebody had found a supply of cracked wheat that had been stored in the tunnels in 25-pound bags since 1918. I'm not saying it was edible, but we ate it, and we ate the worm larva that floated to the top of the cereal because it was protein. The people who did not survive would not eat what we had. On May 5th, after an intensive air and artillery bombardment, Japanese soldiers landed on Corregidor and forced the surrender of General Wainwright unconditionally. Brantley would spend the next 32 months a POW at Santo Tomas Internment Camp. Although the entire population of Native Americans in the United States was just 450,000 during World War II, some 44,000 served during World War II. This was 10% of the Native American population. The U.S. used Native American languages to develop secret battle communications. The Axis never deciphered the code talkers' messages. In just 1 month, the Battle of Iwo Jima, referred to by the GIs as the meat grinder, had cost 6,821 American lives and some 18,000 wounded. The losses for the Japanese had been far worse. Of General Kiribashi's 21,000 soldiers, all but 216 were killed. After 4 days of intense fighting, Mount Suribachi was captured and the American flag was raised on its summit, not once, but twice. After 3 days of intense fighting, backed by naval and air bombardments, First Lieutenant Harold Scheer volunteered to lead a platoon of 40 Marines to the summit of Mount Suribachi, where they raised the U.S. flag at 10:20 a.m. on February 23rd to the cheers of the Marines locked in a deadly battle with the Japanese machine gunners and snipers below. The flag buoyed not only the spirits of the Marines, but also the naval men whose bombardments had provided them with cover. The big American ships sounded their whistles upon seeing the stars and stripes. A second, larger flag was raised 3 hours after word had come to the 2nd Battalion Lieutenant Colonel Chandler W. Johnson, Scheer's commanding officer, that the U.S. Secretary of Navy intended to have the first flag lowered and given to him as a souvenir. "To hell with that," Johnson declared. His Marines had sacrificed much in Iwo Jima's meat grinder, and the flag represented their sacrifice. It belonged to the battalion. Johnson ordered it taken down, secured, and replaced with a larger flag. It was the hoisting of the larger flag 3 hours later that was captured in the famous picture of Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal's. Rosenthal's picture, which later became the inspiration for the U.S. Marine Corps War Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery, also captured the immense price both sides paid for Iwo Jima. 3 of the 6 men who raised the second flag that day would lose their lives on Iwo Jima just days or weeks after the picture was taken. Of the 3 men who survived, one man, Native American Ira Hayes, was haunted by the fact that he was but one of 5 men in his platoon of 45 who survived the battle, and one of 27 survivors in his company of 250. Hayes was welcomed home as a war hero. He went across the country selling war bonds, and he even played himself in the John Wayne movie Sands of Iwo Jima. Visitors and letters of appreciation flooded the quiet reservation where he once lived. Hayes could not accept this celebrity status, especially knowing that so many of his friends still lay in the ground at Iwo Jima. He commented, "They were better men than me, and they're not coming back, much less back to the White House like me." About the famous Rosenthal picture, Hayes said, "Sometimes I wish that guy had never made that picture." Unable to return to the anonymous life he once had on his reservation, Hayes died 3 months after President Eisenhower unveiled the celebrated War Memorial. After a night of heavy drinking, mourning the good buddies he lost, Hayes died a haunted man, still trapped on Iwo Jima's bloody beaches. Asian Americans also made a significant contribution in World War II. 33,000 Japanese Americans served in the armed forces. The population at the time was 130,000, so 25% of all Japanese Americans served in World War II. An estimated 20,000 Chinese Americans served, which represented 22% of the population at the time. Japanese American men not in the military were classified as enemy aliens. The majority of the 130,000 Japanese Americans in the U.S. were forcibly relocated to internment camps, even if they had as little as 1/16 of Japanese blood. The decision to intern Japanese Americans was upheld by the Supreme Court and 1944. Japanese Americans who were interned lost everything. Finally, in 1980, President Carter named a commission to investigate whether the internment was justified. The Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians found little evidence of Japanese American disloyalty and determined the decision was based on racism. It recommended that reparations be paid. President Reagan authorized the payment of $20,000 to each Japanese American camp survivor in 1988. Tokyo Rose was the nickname American GIs created for all the women heard on Japanese propaganda radio broadcasts. The most famous of those women was Iva Ikuko Toguri, a Japanese American who had the misfortune of visiting Japan when the war broke out. Forced to either work in a munitions factory or to broadcast to American troops on the radio, she chose the latter. Toguri made a total of 340 broadcasts of the Zero Hour, a 15-minute radio broadcast containing news, music, and propaganda. Although entertaining, the broadcasts were intended by the Japanese to break the spirit of the fighting troops with their suggestions that their wives and girlfriends were cheating on them back home. Toguri herself refused to ever read anything over the air that was critical of the United States. The broadcasts themselves, written by American and Australian POWs, often cleverly mocked the Japanese imperial government, which didn't understand the nuanced double entendres. Throughout her time as Tokyo Rose, Toguri remained loyal to the United States. Toguri even used her meager $7 monthly paychecks to buy food, which she smuggled to American POWs interned in the Japanese camps. Despite the protests of other POWs that Toguri had done nothing wrong, and the documented evidence that she regularly smuggled food to POWs, after the war Toguri was charged with treason and sentenced to 10 years in prison. While she was incarcerated, Toguri remained patriotic and was remembered by her fellow prisoners for always standing at attention during the national anthem. Eventually, President Gerald Ford pardoned Toguri in 1977 when it was discovered that the witnesses against her in her trial had been forced to commit perjury. Toguri could easily have been bitter. The U.S. citizenship she had refused to revoke under pressure by the Japanese was stripped from her by her own government. Her Portuguese husband and daughter were refused entrance to the United States. Her daughter later died as a result of the desperate conditions of post-war Japan. While in prison, Toguri was denied repeated requests to see her dying mother, and on top of her long imprisonment, Toguri was forced to pay the Justice Department a large fine. Despite all that, Toguri never wavered, her father later telling her, "You were like a tiger. You never changed your stripes. You stayed American through and through." Toguri lived just long enough for the World War II Veterans Committee to bestow her with the Citizenship Award in her 89th year for her love of country and the courage that she showed her fellow Americans despite being persecuted by first the Japanese and then her own country. It took the contribution of all Americans to win World War II. The Axis powers and the Aryan ideology was defeated by white, black, Hispanic, Native American, Asian American, and women soldiers in our armed forces. They fought for freedom. Sometimes they fought for rights that they didn't even have back at home, but for the idea that we can make a braver, more just, freer world. As their voices are silenced, it is left for those of us who follow in their footsteps to tell their stories and to speak their names, so that all they endured for you, for me, for future generations may be forever remembered. As long as their stories are told, the veterans of World War II live on. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I hope you'll go to my channel. Always remember World War II through veterans' eyes, and check out some other videos. And of course, I hope that you'll seek out my book, which contains these stories and many, many more. We owe so much to these veterans, and the least that we can give back is honoring their name and honoring their memory. May their names never leave our lips. Thank you, and God bless.